This is how to knit a swatch in the round. So if you've decided that you have a project that you want to check your gauge for, and it's a circular project, so done in the round, like a hat, anything else that's circular, you need to do a different type of swatching than you would do for a flat project. So a flat project is easier because you're just going to have your straight needles, you're just going to be knitting one way, purling back. It's pretty straightforward, back and forth. You're just working to get that 4x4 square so that you can measure your gauge from that. But when you're doing it in the round, it's different because when we're knitting in the round, we're only knitting, right? So we're spiraling around. All of the stitches are knit stitches, well, in this case, depending on your pattern, but typically you'll have a gauge that said that it's done in stockinette, which will be all knit stitches knitted around. So it's actually quite different, usually tighter than it would be using the same yarn and the same needles and doing it flat, because purling tends to loosen things up. So when we're just knitting around and around and around, it's often tighter. So I've gotten into trouble a little bit trying to knit swatches flat for a circular project and then not having the gauge be right, because it's quite different for me, maybe less for other people, but quite a bit different for me. So there's a few different things that we have to do for knitting a swatch in the round that's different than the flat. So what we're gonna do, so my gauge for a project like this is something like in that 4x4 square that we talked about when we were measuring our gauge, something like 9 inches across, so 9 stitches across, and then 14 up. So you notice those numbers are fairly different. Going up, that rise part of the tension is often more condensed than the length of it. So that's just something to know. It's never going to be, well, probably never even. So I would never have like a 9x9 in my 4x4 square. It doesn't really matter, but sometimes I'm like, whoa, that's really different. It's so many more stitches going up, or so many rows or rounds going up. But just something to know. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go ahead and cast on. So because I want about 9 stitches in that 4 inches across, I'm going to cast on more than that. Well, you would do that for any swatch anyways, but especially for this one. So what I'm going to do is I want a border of maybe like 3 stitches on each side, just so that those stitches don't affect the actual measurement. I want those 9-ish stitches in the middle to be just normal stitches, not pulled, not curling. You'll see what happens, especially with this. It looks really funny. So I'm going to go ahead and cast on about 16 just to make sure I have lots of room on either side. And so let's just see here. So I'll just do that quickly. I'm not going to go into detail about this. You can check out the other videos about doing a long tail cast on here. Oops. Get them on there. So this swatch it's going to look really strange, but that's okay, because the good thing about doing this is that we don't have to knit all the way around. So with this toque, I have 40 stitches on there. So for me to swatch all those 40 stitches all the way around, that's a lot of knitting, right? It's basically the whole hat almost. So we have a little trick to not have to knit all the way around, but so that we're actually still knitting all of those stitches. Let's see how we're doing here. Okay, so we'll take a few back off. So that's about 16 on there. Yeah, so again, it doesn't matter a huge amount how many you have, but you do want, if we're going to be measuring something like those 9 stitches right in the middle, we want to have some off to the side that can be sort of throwaway stitches that won't affect how we're counting it. So typically, if we were going to be knitting a flat swatch, at this point I would turn this over and start knitting back the other way, or probably purling in this case. But the trick to this swatching in the round is that instead of that, we're always going to be sliding the work to the other needle, so across to the other side, and then really important now. So what I'm going to do, because I need my yarn over here, this is where I'm going to knit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull this really funny looking floppy strand of yarn and let it hang loose. It needs to be really loose, more than the length of your work. And you'll see why here. So from there, I'm going to now pretend that this is my point in my yarn that I'm going to knit with, and then I'm just going to knit across. So all knit stitches here, making sure to hold that so that you have that loop hanging loose. And like I say, it's going to look really funny and really messy, but it is okay. So I'm just going to knit across. We'll just do a few just so you can see the transition back and forth. And we'll have a little look at how that measuring will go. So again, 16 stitches is much nicer than trying out all those 40 stitches around and around and around. So less than half of the stitches to give us our gauge. Okay, so there's my first row. Tighten that back up there. Okay, so there's the first one. And so you can see that by having that long floppy loop of yarn, now I can have my stitches on there without them being pulled at all. So it's almost like I have a flat swatch, except that I have that floppy bit. And then we're just going to do the same thing. So I'm just going to pull, slide that back over. And then the same thing. So I'm going to get the same amount of yarn. And as you knit, it's really the most important with that first stitch. As you knit into there, you're just going to make really sure that you don't pull it any tighter. Because once you get that first one done, then you should be good to go. So we'll just knit across again, and we'll have one more look. And again, I said in my other video about when you're measuring your gauge that I do this not very often. If I'm testing a pattern, the designer will often want to know if I got the gauge that they got, so then it's more important. But if it's just a project for me, I don't always do this. So, okay. So I'm going to go back. I'm going to start the next row. No, I'm not. Okay. So you can see here. So we've got this swatch, and you can see now, even though those loops look so floppy and so loose, when I straighten this out, they actually do start to get pulled fairly tightly. So you need a lot of length. Like I would say almost about twice the length of your stitches on there, just to really make sure that you're not pulling. So if we said that this was much longer, so what if I was doing my full swatch here, I would knit all the way up to more than 4 inches, because again, you need sort of a border above and below. So if our gauge was 14 stitches or 14 rows to that 4 inches, then I would probably do something like 20 rows. Again, just because that bottom's gonna curl. Yeah, so just giving yourself that space. But from there, if we try to have a little look here, now of course this is not going to be accurate because I don't have that nice sort of box of perfect stitches in the middle with the funny stitch border that I can ignore. But if I was going to do it, laying my swatch flat, and just like we looked at with the finished toque, just counting across those 4 stitches and seeing where I'm at there. But that's the trick to knitting a swatch in the round without having to actually knit your whole item, the whole circumference around, just pulling those loops, really making sure that you leave them nice and loose so that you can get a true measurement. If they were too tight, what would be happening is that this would be trying to curl on you and it would be pulling tight, and so then it's impossible to get your accurate measurement. So you need lots and lots of room there. But that's the tricks for knitting a swatch in the round.